As we welcome Dr. Hans Vijayasuriya to the stage, I'm just going to read out his bio as well. He's a key figure in Sri Lanka's digital transformation, formerly the Group Executive Director at Asiata Group. He is now the Chief Advisor to the President of Sri Lanka on digital economy and the Chairman of the Information and Communication Technology Agency, ICTA. Dr. Vijayasuriya's expertise encompasses digital transformation, mobile technology, and innovation ecosystems. Dr. Hans, the floor is over to you to help us navigate privacy and ethics in a connected world.
Good afternoon, everyone. Aiboan. Welcome to Sri Lanka. Those who have traveled from overseas, also an honor to be here at the HBS Alumni Conference. So first of all, can I just see a show of hands who's from India? Okay, so large majority. Because why I asked that question is in describing the approach and the blueprint and roadmap towards digital transformation in Sri Lanka, which is now being embarked upon an accelerated basis. The foundations, the architecture, and a lot of the fundamental assumptions about adoption of digital services and also digital public infrastructure in particular comes from learnings which are highly influenced by the Indian success story. So that's a benchmark learning ground. We've also, of course, incorporated aspects of the Singapore ecosystem because after looking around at global benchmarks and global examples of whole of economy digital transformations, we kind of zeroed down on these two benchmarks because on one hand, the socio-economy, if you look at the socio-economic dimension, India and Sri Lanka are very, very similar. And inclusion dimensions, inclusion prerogatives, and how you achieve them can be addressed in a very similar manner in these two markets. On the other hand, Sri Lanka and Singapore have many similarities when it comes to the fact that we are relatively small islands, high proportion of tourism income within the GDP, and also our ports and logistics also form a larger proportion of the overall economy. So these were the commonalities. So learning from these markets and also from our own experience, we have set ourselves some very aggressive targets for the expansion of the digital economy by 5 times in 4 years. So that's going from around $3 billion today to north of 15 billion by 2030. In terms of a component within the overall economy, that's moving from around 3.5% to 4% to a number north of 12% in the next 4 years. And this means that in order to achieve this kind of leapfrog growth, we need to target the penetration of digital methodologies, digital tools, digital raw material, which is data, of course, into multiple sectors of the economy. That's an ambitious set of targets, and also it requires us to use a very programmatic and benchmark-driven approach, because what we are trying to achieve in 4 years is what panned out in, say, India over the last 13 years, in Singapore over the last 15 years. So the catch-up game, as well as new approaches using AI first, cloud first, mobile first, as leapfrog approaches to catching up within a shorter period of time. So I'll just, since we're going into a panel as well, I won't take too much time, but I'll just describe a few principles that Sri Lanka has put in place. In terms of fundamental principles, inclusion is both an opportunity and a challenge. Opportunity because an inclusion-led approach brings in a much larger ecosystem onto the table. It mobilizes a larger portion of the economy. But from a challenge perspective, it means that every time you deploy new technologies, take AI for example, you have to be very conscious of achieving holistic inclusion. language in particular, so that the same experience across multiple languages, which may not be the case, a challenge in a predominantly English-speaking country. Second, trust, and that's, I think, one of the key topics of the panel itself. And within trust, it spans data protection, privacy, and cybersecurity, and putting primacy onto this dimension. Citizen experience and business experience, driving both citizen satisfaction, NPS across the citizenry, but also driving the be ready kind of indices where we look to delivering a much better experience for businesses dealing with government and also with local authority. On the technology side, the key architectural principles, I won't go into too much detail because they're very similar to what we are seeing in the region. But starting late, you need to set these standards, and by adhering to them in a programmatic fashion, you get the opportunity to leapfrog. So AI first, cloud first, and mobile first, as I mentioned. Also, to use an API-driven and open architecture. Meaning, what does that mean for the non-techies here? That you open up all your systems so that they are not vendor-locked, they are not locked into very siloed implementations, but that they all open up into a common horizontal layer. And you can call this digital public infrastructure, you can call it national data exchange, etc. There are many components which form a kind of spine which runs across government. Now, there's a reason to place primacy on this, because in Sri Lanka, we could describe the digital transformation landscape as very much of a brownfield, meaning that many of the institutions have good digital systems. And they deliver reasonable experience if the citizen journey is siloed, meaning that you have to deal with just one institution. But typically, citizen journeys span multiple institutions. So if you want to go and get your passport, for instance, you will have to visit multiple institutions to get your birth certificate, your Grama Niladhari certificate, your police certificate, and then deliver or go and submit your biometrics in another place, etc. Now, for this experience to be made seamless and single point of contact, you need to rely on this horizontal interoperability. And with horizontal interoperability comes in the fact that data, the flow of data, the sharing of data, and the exchange of data is fundamental to building this new digital experience. And when all those things happen, sharing, exchange, and interoperability, we are talking of increasing the risk of data vulnerabilities, because it's very much a data-driven economy then. And therefore, your cybersecurity constructs both on top of your cloud as well as at each API. Every single API or application programming interface or a plug where data flows between one institution and another have to be protected to a much larger extent. Privacy and consent need to be built in to the national data exchange infrastructure itself. And we call it RegTech, regulatory technology, you call it privacy tech, etc., which means that you embed these concepts, these policies of who can share with whom, what consent is required before something is shared, how long can data be preserved, when does it need to be destroyed, etc., etc., need to move from manual regulation or paper-based regulation into the tech itself. And then when these key components of the middle layer that I described, or the horizontal layer, all have policy built into them, you get the level of protection, and both cyber protection as well as privacy and data inbuilt in the design. So that's a very quick fire, because Kandavan asked me to stay to 7 minutes. So that's a very quick fire description of how we are building the architecture, plus the primacy that is being given to privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity. There's a lot of tech detail behind that, but I think if I say that the primacy on these trust dimensions combined with inclusion and using an open architecture enables us to do many things in parallel, meaning that you deploy systems in parallel, where in our neighboring and regional benchmark countries, they were done in series. And hence the leapfrog ambition and the leapfrog opportunity. Jury is out whether that approach will work, but I think if Sri Lanka is to catch up in this period, the objective is to enable parallel development of multiple systems on a strong bedrock of privacy and cybersecurity. So I'll stop there and go into the forum or the panel. Thank you.
Joining Dr. Vijay Surya on stage now for a panel on the same topic is Suraj Munandyat, Ramesh Kumar Shah, and Lakshanti Fernando for a panel discussion to expand on what we heard during this speech. Suraj is the India head and vice president of the professional services at Precisely, a global data integrity software company. An active angel investor, corporate strategist, and a Harvard Business School alum, he frequently speaks on business scaling, technology strategy, and data integrity, emphasizing the power of leveraging technology to drive business growth and value. Ramesh Kumar P. Shah has anchored the transformation of RK Group from a modest textile trading firm in Bangalore to a dynamic conglomerate active across multiple industries, including retail, technology, e-commerce, NDCs, and more. He has consistently pioneered new services and solutions tailored for the fast-growing digital marketplace, building a culture of innovation and operational excellence. Lakshanti Fernando is a leading Singapore-based lawyer specializing in international arbitration, litigation, and employment. A partner at CMS Singapore and managing director of CMS Holborn Asia, she is an advocate and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Singapore with an LLB honors from the National University of Singapore. From data breaches to digital ethics, these leaders are confronting the big question: can we innovate responsibly? Suraj, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Hans, for a lovely context and the context setting into this panel. And I'm sure after the AI panel, I'm sure a lot of you are still worried and scared. So this panel is not about scaring, but it's more about talking about the potential, that and the opportunity that exists in the space. So let's straight jump in. Today's panel brings together three remarkable leaders, each shaping the digital transformation journey through a unique vantage point. So jumping to Dr. Hans, I took the privilege to research a bit about you, about the work that you've been doing. I think it's been phenomenal over the last decade. And you often said the Sri Lanka's digital economy is on a journey from transformation to transformation leadership. How would you define Sri Lanka's digital transformation in 2025 and over the next 5 years, not just say for the domestic economy, but for the Sri Lanka's relevance on the world stage?
I think the first point that we need to internalize is that digital, and now increasingly AI, of course, resides at the very epicenter of our economies. So just like digital sits at the very epicenter of our lives and our households, and is changing behaviors and family interactions, when you look at the level of a national economy and the competitive advantage of nations, I think increasingly digital is taking a position of unique strength or unique relevance. And it's right at the epicenter, and therefore the level to which you're competitive in the use of digital tools will determine to an increasing extent the competitiveness of the nation relative to others. Now, fast forward to AI, I think that relevance increases dramatically. And those nations who use AI in a progressive as well as future oriented manner and in a pervasive manner in their economies will jump ahead. Now, the other factor which is moving at the same pace is the incisiveness of that divide. So, when we go back 20 years and we were talking about a digital divide, yes, there was a divide, but it was a sort of fairly graduated divide. You can call it, a low gradient hill going down into the valley. But with digital, it sharpened. And now with AI, I feel it will be a very, very incisive yes, no binary kind of divide. And that is where all our nations, I think, you talked about relativity, right, with other nations. All our nations have to be very conscious that on one hand, you need to be inclusive internally, but on the other, you have to be very conscious that unless you match up in terms of the use of these technologies and the deployment of these technologies towards economic growth, that the competitiveness of nations can shift very dramatically and very quickly. And hence the whole AI divide as a big topic. Now, countries like Sri Lanka, small, not much bargaining power, we have a mountain to climb because we need to be able to leverage position in some way, talent, trust networks, capability to attract the global players to give us sufficient AI capacity and infrastructure. And we must make sure we don't fall a prey to AI geopolitics as well. So these are the new challenges that are coming up. Hence, I think 2025, while we have set ourselves these ambitious targets and things are getting into place and we are very positive about achieving them, new challenges have come around in the form of potential AI divide and a potential gap, which we need to make sure we are on the right side of that gap and not on the wrong one.
Thank you, Dr. Hans. Moving into the business and the consumer experience side, and moving to Mr. Ramesh here. Before I jump into Ramesh's question, how many of you shop online at least once a week? That's a lot of hands. And how many of you actually read the privacy consent before clicking agree? Yeah, there are still few show of hands. That's good to know. So on the retail side, Mr. Shah, the retail and e-commerce sectors have completely reshaped by digitalization. And where do you see the biggest growth opportunities emerging in this space?
Thank you, Suraj. I hope I am audible. So thank you for inviting on this panel. It's last moment. I just directly came from the flight here.
Thank you so much.
No, it's my pleasure. So today, whatever I'm going to share, I'll be sharing last 10 years of my experience being in the digital commerce world. And I hope it can add some value. Coming back to e-commerce, today the whole world is moving towards a commerce digital. And if I talk about the India, where my experience is, I was a very early entrant into the commerce way back in 2013. So it's a long journey. Initially, when we started, we with the large market players like Amazon and Walmart, we used to go to the brand, sit for hours to get an appointment and ask them to list on the marketplace. Because it was a chicken and egg. The traffic was not there. They didn't know the delivery, how many people will buy, how the delivery will happen, how the payments will happen, how the reverse logistic will happen. But today's position, all the brands in India have a FOMO. They say if you're not digital commerce, you lost the battle. And you might have observed a lot of people are from India here. The quick commerce in last 2 years, I will say it's an innovation from India. I hope it lasts. Last 2 years, every year on year, it is growing at 100% every year by year. Now, going forward, how the digital commerce is going to evolve, because I am in the middle of the auction, we have partner with 12 different platforms. I can tell you, apart from the quick commerce, the next thing is going to be very clearly omni-channel. So every single player who have the physical store, they're building the technology to see how localized they can do the last mile delivery. And the third thing, which we are already in the thick of the business, is a cross-border. As the world is becoming flat, all the logistics is sorted out, the payment issues are sorted out, the customs has become very friendly. It's become flat. From any country to any country, you can just open the shop, you don't need to register locally, and you can start selling in India any part of the country. And you can know how the product is doing, and then you can keep changing the product or getting the insight about the products. And the other thing is social commerce, which you all people know. And with this digital commerce, lot of startups, lot of individuals are able to manage the D2C business. So actually it is greatly transformed the business. And today large brands are behind. And unfortunately people who has lot of manufacturing capacity and who has lot of offline store are not able to do the digital commerce so well. But people who are new, they doesn't have to lose anything. They don't have a distribution setup. They don't need to worry about the price parity, and they are able to straight go and start. But the established brand is a challenging. Like for example, even HUL or PNG or for example, Madura Garments, they always have to balance offline and online. So these are the insights of the Indian e-commerce, more or less. Thank you.
Thank you, RK. What is the point when we talk about innovation and technology without the policy and governance? So moving on to Lakshanti here, how has the digitalization changed the nature of disputes that you see in Singapore, particularly in the data privacy, cybersecurity, and cross-border digital commerce?
Thanks. Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me. I was really heartened to hear Dr. Hans Vijayasuriya mention Singapore as a benchmark, because that's what I like to hear in many ways. And I think there are a lot of similarities between what Singapore has adopted as a relatively small nation, obviously with a very different social construct, but still I think has a lot of parallels with Sri Lanka. And when Dr. Hans mentioned it, out of curiosity, I just looked up how much Singapore had invested in our digital transformation. There isn't one figure in typical Singapore fashion, but they have, I got some numbers here, which is that Singapore's digital economy grew by 12 billion in 2024, reaching about 128 billion, which accounts for about 16.8% of our GDP. And what I also thought was quite interesting was that in 2021, Singapore said that they would invest $50 million over the next 5 years in building digital trust capabilities. And I think fundamentally with Singapore, it's quite an interesting model because Singapore has no statutory right to privacy. So in effect, it's through legislation like our Personal Data Protection Act that they have brought in regulations around personal data. And personal data in the age of digital services and AI-driven platforms has become a source of great contention. And lawyers like ourselves, and I think in the previous panel, I believe it was Saju who mentioned that, you know, ostriches burying our heads in the sand. Lawyers would love to bury their heads in the sand when it comes to digitalization because we're the last bastion of charging the hourly rate for research and review and preparing for cases. And so have to a degree, when I started practice, when we thought about privacy, it was really around employment-related matters like breach of confidence. But now that has fundamentally changed. Now we're dealing with complaints, often made to the Personal Data Protection Commission in Singapore, around the improper use of data, around, you know, inadequate security measures. The regulators will often open investigations, take that very seriously. Companies can face severe penalties. That has really fundamentally transformed how we look at data in Singapore. And now, with a lot of our clients, they're multinational companies, so they are navigating a myriad of laws and inconsistent approaches across APAC, in particular, around privacy, around data collection. And so, when you are using data that is stored or processed overseas, companies need consistency. So, I think we're going to talk about that later, about the harmonization of digital rules. But Singapore, in many ways, has tried to get ahead of the curve through legislature. And I think without proper laws, you cannot really regulate such sensitive issues, because often a cybersecurity incident will become a national security threat. So for instance, in Singapore's Cybersecurity Act, which was enacted in 2018, it designates key sectors like healthcare, like transport, like banking, as critical information infrastructure. So if there is a cybersecurity incident, for example, that affects these sectors, the regulators will step in, and it can impact, for example, how a civil proceeding in the court or in an arbitration, how you deal with evidence. So regulators can say, for example, that a vendor who was negligent and thereby caused a cybersecurity breach, they can't produce their system logs because that relates to a banking sector. So that affects then how the courts or the arbitrators will then adjudicate that dispute. So often what I see in practice is that the courts and the arbitrators will step back a little bit and wait for the regulators to complete their investigations, because often those findings will influence how they decide the case. And there's going to be that constant friction between the public policy element, which comes to an issue of public trust, as well as the private law aspect, which is how things are normally dealt in practice through the civil or commercial suits. So what I'm seeing increasingly with the type of disputes we're seeing is that maybe 10 years ago, well, not too long ago, we did one of the first cryptocurrency disputes before the Singapore High Court. It wasn't reported because we ended up resolving it, but it was one of the first cases, and the judges hadn't dealt with anything like it. So now we're moving to a very different system where we're having expert judges, expert arbitrators. Singapore has decided through our Singapore International Arbitration Center, where I sit on the Users Council, because they care about what multinational companies use Singapore as a hub for dispute resolution. So through our Singapore International Commercial Court and the SIIC, we have expert panels, expert judges to decide these cases. We're also recognizing that they're going to be more jurisdictionally complex, more technically complex, and more regulatory in nature. So I think for emerging markets that are trying to deal with these issues, I think if you don't get the legislature right, and if you don't also look at harmonization through international frameworks. For example, Singapore has the digital economy agreements with the UK, South Korea, and Australia. It's a move to harmonization of international digital trade rules. And if you don't have tech-savvy adjudicators in courts, then it's really hard to navigate the ethical and privacy aspects of increasing digitalization.
Great. I think earlier today we heard about how Singapore deals with corruption and any of these data breaches. I'm sure these things are pretty tight in Singapore, and we have a lot to learn from there. Coming back to Dr. Hans, hearing Lakshanti, what does Sri Lanka offer to the Asia Pacific region and beyond in the digital infrastructure, services, talent, or innovation that may be underappreciated today?
So Sri Lanka has a very small, obviously, when we're talking relative to India or many of the Southeast Asian countries, the talent pool is small. But in my opinion and what I have seen, the competitiveness of this talent pool punches way above the weight of the country. AI talent in particular, a very high penetration of AI talent. And when we look at Sri Lanka's, I would say, Ivy League talent or the top universities in Sri Lanka, compare head-on with the IITs of India, for instance, or National University of Singapore, there are students who easily transfer and perform extremely well. So Sri Lanka has to, in this context, you have a high-skilled, high-value pool. You're, on the other hand, often victim to migration because many developed economies pinch your human capital. And at the same time, we need to use digital talent both internally and in the form of digital exports to grow the digital economy and the export revenues in digital and services. So that challenge has to be, I think, addressed through identifying what's the value proposition. And I think that was your question. And Sri Lanka is building a value proposition around two T's, that is talent and trust. Trust because the laws in Sri Lanka, both intellectual property as well as the PDPA, the Personal Data Protection Act, the Electronic Signatures Act, etc., and computer crimes, these are very mature legislation which was put in place, I think, some of them even before 2010, and with some degree of modernization, the suite of trust legislation in Sri Lanka can be or is up to a very highly competitive position in international perspective. Talent I described. Now the combination of these two, talent and trust, is something which investors look for going forward. It's less about cost arbitrage, it's less about a cheap destination. It's about a trusted destination which is secure and which is highly connected, because Sri Lanka again has a portfolio of international cables which is second to none, coming in and out. And that is the kind of positioning that we project for Sri Lanka, a talent capital on the backdrop of trust. Now the other proposition is that Sri Lanka is just entering that explosive growth phase in digital. Now, if you put numbers behind that 5x growth of the digital economy, and you do your math on the GDP growth rate being uplifted 1 or 2 points due to the expansion of the digital economy as we saw in India, then the number you'll come up with is anywhere between 35 to 75 billion US. And even if you look at the 25 to 50 trillion US projected for the global economy through AI and rapid digitalization by 2030, and you take Sri Lanka's fair share of that, just the fair share, not a overweight share, even the fair share will give you a number of around 50 billion. These are big numbers, just high level numbers, but someone somewhere is going to capture this value. In the 5 years, if digital transformation happens, if talent comes to the table, if the trust environment is solid, this value pool is going to get created. Now, who grabs that value pool? And that is another proposition. It's a third proposition. Invest in Sri Lanka, participate in Sri Lanka, use Sri Lankan talent, rely on Sri Lankan trust environments. There is 50 north billion US dollars of value to be created. And which segments, which investors, which countries or bilateral partners will capture this? That's kind of my Sri Lanka pitch.
No, great. I think I certainly picked up the talent and trust as the most competitive edge for Sri Lanka. If we should be highlighting the positioning in Sri Lanka, and that's great to know. Coming to Mr. RK, when we compare the digital adoption across the economies, what lessons can emerging markets like Sri Lanka draw from countries like the US and China converted connectivity into commerce?
So I'm sure, especially from US, because they were the very early in the commerce. I think Amazon started way back in 1992 or 1993, and they replaced the Barnes and Nobles, which was the largest bookstore. They started with big store, but fast forward 20 years, if you see, the Amazon logo says A to Z. So anything and everything you can buy on commerce today. So I think Amazon, because of early starting and started this commerce, what US brought in was the trust. And they build the trust saying, okay, you buy online, you will get what you ordered, and you will get the brands what you have ordered. Coming back to China, what you can take it from China is similarly catching on US. What China did was, right from manufacturing to go to the market strategy, and in between they solve the supply chain logistic very strongly. And they use the influencers and everybody, and they went to the market. I'll give it one particular brand example called Sheen. I mean, today globally, if you see all the apparel brands, three large brand. I mean, there is no fourth brand. If you see the global presence, Ajara, H&M, and Uniqlo. These are all 20 billion plus brands. But Sheen alone, making this strategy, they became the, at one point of time, not today because of the geopolitical issues, they were 100 billion valuation. And how did they manage to do? It's a speed, fast forward. What is fast forward? The fashion. And they cracked the supply chain logistics. And I think Sri Lanka is very, very well placed where they are. I mean, doctor has spoken about the small quantity, but it is a quality which matters. I've been visiting Sri Lanka from last 30 years. I love this country. I've been to the Slith University. I came here a couple of times to do the startups with Rajan Anandan, if you know. He's a Sri Lankan. He once headed the India Google and then now Sequoia. So Sri Lanka has a huge potential, in my opinion, in commerce, in technology development, in backend. So yeah, that's what from China and US I can say. Trust in the speed.
Great, and that's exactly what this big, bold, brave is all about, and bringing these opportunities from world to Sri Lanka. And going back to Lakshanti, with all this regional diversity, do you see a growing need for international harmonization of data and the digital laws, or will these regional diversity always prevail?
There's going to be tension between the international nature of digitalization and the territorial nature of the law. So you're sort of seeing trends in both directions. And I think there is a case to be made for both in a way, because you've got international harmonization. What does that effectively mean? That means basically a set standard of rules and common baselines for effectively for multinational companies to operate with some degree of certainty and consistency. You don't want situations where companies are unable to grapple with, different countries having varying standards of privacy and data protection. That's going to create a great degree of uncertainty. And with the development of AI and, high impact innovation, and new digital tools, there needs to be some common baselines. I also think that we have to be aware, and I think we are all aware, that cyber issues are global. They don't respect borders. So there needs to be a standard approach amongst countries towards enforcement and investigations. So if these governments don't talk to each other and the regulators don't talk to each other, there can be serious issues that are created as a result. But then ultimately, fundamentally, there's the social, cultural, and political context that we live in. And countries don't want to follow another country in the development of laws that are going to govern very sensitive information. There's also some degree of, I think, competition between countries. So everyone wants to sort of be the front runner in developing these laws because they see this as a strategic benefit or advantage. I think it's called the Brussels effect versus the Beijing effect. And also fundamentally, I think that we have very different concepts of privacy. So as I mentioned before, Singapore has no statutory right to privacy. It deals with it through legislation. In the EU, it's seen as a fundamental right. In the US, it's considered a consumer protection issue. And in China, it's embedded in their sovereignty and data concerns, protection concerns. So also, countries will have varying degrees of tolerance for surveillance and the use of data and risk. So that's all driven by their own social, political, and cultural constraints or constructs, whatever you want to call it. So I think while I think there is a growing trend towards harmonization, I do believe that countries will retain their own regimes. I see it as a model that is of mutual recognition and interoperability instead of one global law. So you can see that in the Singapore approach, right? So Singapore maintains its own regimes, but it has entered into digital economy agreements with other countries for some set degree of standardization and protections and certification standards, and so on. And I've seen that also in cross-border data transfer contracts. There are standardized clauses that we are now increasingly seeing. So there's some consistency when it comes to the cross-border transfer of data. So in short, what I believe is going to be the trend is that harmonization will grow, but pluralism, in my view, will still prevail.
Great. Thank you, Lakshanti. And Dr. Hans, I've as I said, I had the privilege to research a bit about the work that you've been doing, and it's great to see the big, bold, brave goal to grow the digital economy that you've set, which is like close to 3 to 5% to taking it to all the way to 15% and of GDP within the 5 years. What are the top 3 enablers that must click in this next 12 months to make that vision credible, and what's that single biggest risk that you see?
I would put it down to interoperability of multiple forms. So at all layers, if you look at the payment layer, needs to be 100% interoperable and also open, sufficiently open for startups and the broader economy to come on board digital payments. And that leads directly to commerce. Interoperability between institutions, data sharing, etc. So that whole topic of, and the thesis that in a country which we describe as a brownfield in digital, where there are good systems already in place, the thesis that you can exploit the strengths of incumbent, or you can call them legacy systems, that you can exploit those strengths by inserting a DPI or digital public infrastructure layer in between, gives you that time advantage. And that's the thesis. So the risk is that that thesis gets held up due to siloed institutional thinking or resistance and so on. But I think the government, the political will is very strong this time around to get this done. But when from the Indian example alone, you can see that once that interoperability starts working, once the DPI start moving, then multiple services and multiple revenue streams, opening up of infrastructure for startups to work on, etc., comes into play. So the risk is actually man-made resistance. It's not so much the technology. So equally, we are applying a lot of our focus on change management, on capacity building, on taking the public sector as well as the citizenry through this change, taking out the fear, introducing some excitement, and moving the pedal from moderate speed to high speed.
That's a pretty bold vision, and I'm really wish success on that journey. Mr. RK, given the India's size and appetite for diverse products, what opportunities do you see for the Sri Lankan businesses to tap into the Indian market through the cross-border e-commerce platforms?
Frankly, when I started being a part of large marketplace way back in '93, I did visited Sri Lanka a few times, and I said, why can't we see the opportunity from Sri Lanka? Because I've been visiting Sri Lanka from quite long, and I always saw the Sri Lanka is another state of India, right? It's a Kerala, extended Kerala. Very similar, same population, 92% literacy, a broader GDP. But I don't know why Sri Lanka has not treated India as a great partner for commerce. Geopolitical issues, or I don't know. Many where I have seen in Southeast Asia, especially, political comes to commerce. But if you see China and Taiwan, politically they fight differently. But comes to commerce, they cooperate like nobody like they're very, very close neighbors, two brothers. Because I know some of the trade which happens between Taiwan and China. But the first political fallout is commerce. We stop the commerce first. And the second, unfortunately, is sports. I mean, we don't know what is the reason we do it. Why are these two culprits when political differences come? Maybe that is one of the thing. But I feel Sri Lanka, coming back to your question, has a huge opportunities to treat India as a market because India is growing, young, digital. The only two things which they need to sort it out is supply chain logistics, which is also not very difficult. If China has solved the supply chain logistics to India, we have 600 brands listed on our platform through on Amazon through us from China. But I tried couple of times, none of the brands from Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a strength. Sri Lanka has a strong apparel base here. Mass Sri Lanka, especially in lingeries. Sri Lanka has strong teas, pearls. India has a huge market. Even if they takes small percentage of the share, that can be big. I always see why not Sri Lanka has few billionaires and multi-millionaires as entrepreneurs. I wonder. And I love Sri Lanka. They're hardworking people. They're smart people. And India is a big market, just 1.5 hours flight. I mean, I had a breakfast and I just like here. It's like going to Bombay or closer than Bombay.
No, I think the change is in order, and yesterday we had the privilege to meet Dr. Mr. Chaturanga, the industries minister, and he was really excited about this conference in itself, and he immediately shared details to understand how we can collaborate, how we can get started and start working together, and probably the change is coming, and I think this conference really brings together these big changes to happen globally. So thank you for that. And one final question, Dr. Hans, if you could fast forward to 2030, what single digital milestone, platform, or global achievement would make you proud to say Sri Lanka made it? What bold, brave do we need to make today to get there?
I keep it fairly simple. I think if we can get a 60% active use of the digital ID, the Aadhaar equivalent, you can get 60% active use, not just registration. That would mean that everything else is moving, and we would be on track for the overall financial targets.
Brilliant. And one last question, Lakshanti. Do you think privacy as we understand it today will still exist in 10 years, or are we moving towards a new social contract around the data?
I think privacy will still exist, but it will transform from our understanding from it being a right to secrecy into something that's more about a right of agency and accountability. So I think there is going to be a new social contract, especially around data, and it will be less about hiding information, but rather about how that information or that data is shared, used, and trusted.
Thank you so much. I think what we heard today makes one thing clear, that digitalization isn't about technology, it's about the trust. Our region has a chance to grow fast, but also responsibly, where innovation, security, and ethics move together. And thank you, Dr. Hans, Ramesh, Lakshanti, for your insights, and to all of you for being part of this conversation and shaping a secure, ethical, and a connected digital future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mm.